Can't decide and torn between a romantic, comedy, action, or an indie film to watch for the weekend? Well. Golden State Media Concepts Movie Podcast is your ultimate guide to the latest movies. Join us as we dissect the latest on the blockbusters. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Movie Podcast.
Tuning into the GSMC Movie Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I am your host, Casey Baum, and what's up, guys? How's it going? I know that I am a brand new voice for you, as well as this is a brand new outlet for me, and I am more than ecstatic to be your host for today. And I'm sure you're wondering, who is this silky, buttery voice on the mic right now? So I thought that I would give you guys a little bit of a brief introduction before I get started for today, to let you know what my credentials are, why you should even be listening to me in the first place. So I'm just a huge film geek. I'm a huge movie fan. I got into film criticism about 5 or 6 years ago, and I'm currently studying filmmaking as well as film studies at Temple University. But the most important part of that sentence is that I'm a movie fan. Brass tacks, that's it. I love going to the movies. I go to the movies at least once a week, of course, before this whole coronavirus thing started. I went about once a week, and now I try and watch a few movies a week just so I can stay up to date. And that's what we'll be doing today. We're going to be talking about some movies. Today in particular is going to be a little bit weird because some of us are in quarantine, some of us are now out of quarantine, and regardless, there's not a lot of movies coming to theaters. In fact, there are almost none. But lucky for us, there are a lot of movies that are coming to streaming, and a lot coming just available for digital to rent if you have the money to do so. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. Some of the most recent movies to come out on digital, some of my biggest recommendations, and I'm super excited to talk about them. So today is going to be a great show. We're going to talk about Onward, the newest movie from Disney Pixar, currently available to stream on Disney Plus, as well as available to rent at most other places. Then we're going to be talking about The Invisible Man, an adaptation of H.G. Wells, and a brand new reimagining of the entire character from the movie from the 30s, classic Universal Monster, which that one is available to rent on, I believe, most streaming services. I watched that one on Amazon Prime. And then we're going to be talking about Emma, the newest adaptation of the Jane Austen novel, which is also available to rent on Amazon Prime. And then make sure you stay tuned until the very end, because my favorite part of the show, and especially if you're trying to work on a budget, I'm going to be giving you guys my recommendations for top 10 movies streaming on Netflix right now. This is not Netflix originals necessarily. Hint, there might be one or two on that list, but these are just, as of June 2020, my favorite movies that you can stream on Netflix. So a lot of them are just my top 10 movies. I think almost all of them are at least in my top, 25, top 50. So these are my highest recommendations, just so you can also get a taste of what kind of movies I like. And I'm going to try and be as diverse as possible. That's what I like to do. I like to have a diverse list. And that's what we have for today's movies that we're talking about. So you know what? Why don't we just get into it? I'm super excited to talk about Onward, and that's what we're going to be starting with. So Onward. Onward is the newest film from Disney Pixar. It is currently available to stream on Disney Plus. And if you don't have Disney Plus, I would recommend at least getting it for a week free trial. You could watch this then, or you can rent it on a lot of other streaming services. It is definitely worth the rent in some capacity. But I'm going to give you a brief synopsis because I'm going to be going pretty in depth with this. No spoilers, but I just want to make sure that everybody knows what the movie is about before I start talking and get lost in my analysis of this movie. So the basic premise is that it follows two teenage brothers, Ian and Barley, in this mythical, reimagined, half modern, half sort of Middle-earth type world where they have lost their father when they were young. Ian never met him. Barley only knew him for a little bit. But their father was trying to be a warlock, and so he has a spell that on Ian's 16th birthday, it will bring him back for a day. but when they attempt to bring him back, they only get halfway through, and his legs are the only things that are seen. So they have to go on a mythical quest to get the upper half of his body, and shenanigans ensue, as most road trip movies go. And this is a super fun, it's basically a road trip movie, Pixar road trip movie, which is super, super fun. Reminds me kind of Finding Nemo, except not separated, but there is two storylines, one with the mother and one with Ian and Barley, which is super, super fun. And I'm going to say, before I went into this is actually the last movie that I saw in theaters before quarantine. So a little bit nostalgic for me, for the real world, kind of miss it. But I don't think anything is lost in watching this at home. There wasn't really any sort of 3D gimmicks or loud noises that you'll lose without a movie theater experience. I think this actually benefits being at home, especially if you've got a family. It'll be a fun little family watch. But before going into this movie, I was definitely a little bit skeptical, and I'll tell you why. I think a lot of it had to do with recent Pixar movies. There's this really famous trailer for WALL-E, which is a teaser trailer before it came out. And it's a great trailer for WALL-E, but in hindsight, it kind of implies something that isn't as great. So it basically details this lunch back in 1994 with a lot of the Pixar heads. So Pete Docter, John Lasseter, and right before Toy Story came out. So it was almost done. And they talk about some of the movies that they're going to come up with later. So they basically detail Finding Nemo and Monsters, Inc. And then they say that the last one they talked about at that lunch was WALL-E. So it makes a great case for WALL-E, and I do think WALL-E is actually one of the most underrated Pixar movies. But what it kind of implies is that the movies after WALL-E are not this of the same vein, or at least, or maybe even not as good. So that's not to say I don't like Pixar movies post that. I think there are some great ones. I mean, Coco, Inside Out, Up make a case for some of the best Pixar movies. But there definitely is a little bit of a difference. I think the early Pixar movies had a little extra heart, and I think they were a little bit more mature. It was definitely easy for parents to get involved. It sort of had the childlike whimsicality, but still had the emotion and depth that is needed for adults to be hooked into it. And so that's kind of what I was worried about with this movie. And in particular, there are some early things that Pixar does that didn't seem to happen here. So what I mean by that is the world. So Pixar is really good at making new worlds, new universes that you can get immersed in really quickly. And particularly with early Pixar, the story is specific to that world. So you couldn't necessarily do the story, at least to the same caliber that you can do in the world they create. So take, for example, Finding Nemo. Finding Nemo is a story about loss, and you can do a story with a father losing their son in a different environment, but it's based around isolation, and so the ocean kind of adds that level of depth, and there's really nothing going around. It's very open, kind of scary, both for Nemo and Marlin. And then The Incredibles, you can heighten that family dynamic when you are talking about it with superheroes. So this one in particular is definitely a little bit odd. First of all, I thought the whole thing with like the legs of the father was a little bit weird. And in particular, I didn't think that the world translated with the story. The story could have happened anywhere else. You could make it a science-based story. You could even do magic or spirituality in the real world. You don't necessarily have to have it in this mythical realm with elves and fairies and dragons. That also might be a little bit of a personal bias, because that's just never been my favorite aesthetic, ultimately speaking. I don't have anything against it, but I'm more of, I think, a sci-fi person, never really been into the whole, Dungeons and Dragons type mythical world. But I was definitely pleasantly surprised with this movie, I have to say. And a lot of that actually comes down to the world building. The world is super fun. It basically takes modern innovations and melds it with old folklore, like I was saying. So it kind of implies that all of these modern innovations still would have happened because it just has a level of added convenience. So like a ferry, it's much more economical and a lot less effort for a ferry to fly on an airplane than to fly that distance with their wings. So it's kind of funny. There are definitely some light gags there that I really, really like, but it makes an interesting case as to what is the ethics and the relevance of sort of modern innovations, even in our world. But I didn't think that world really translated to the story, and it doesn't to the same extent that I think early Pixar movies does, but that doesn't make it any worse. I actually think the world building is the greatest, best part of this movie. And like I said earlier, it's a road trip movie, which I always love. That being said, there are some parts of this movie that I don't love. So I think compared to early Pixar, so I'm comparing this to early Pixar movies because I'm a big Pixar fan. So I definitely was a little bit more critical than maybe I should have been, because I have to say, I do want to preface this with the fact that I did ultimately enjoy this movie. I think it's a great family flick. I think it's fun. I was never bored. It's definitely enjoyable the entire ride. The structure makes for that to be the case. There are some super fun moments in the beginning. I think some of the humor falls a little bit flat sometimes, or at least there's just not as much of it. I think kids would get a lot out of this, but I don't think there's a lot of as mature humor that adults can really gain anything from, but that doesn't make it not enjoyable. I do think there are some fun moments. There's in particular a scene that is almost kind of scary, especially if you're scared of heights. I was sweating the entire time. So be prepared for that scene, and that might even be scary for some kids, but not to the same extent that it would like scar them. It's just a little bit nerve-wracking ultimately. As far as a film, I think the character design is a little bit lacking, and I only say that because Pixar is just so seasoned in animation, and everything looks really, really good in the backgrounds, and all of their character designs are iconic. Like Mike and Sully, and the Incredibles logo, and WALL-E, like all of it is just in kind of the zeitgeist and the culture. So this one doesn't really offer anything special. It almost looks like DreamWorks, and that's not necessarily a knock. I think DreamWorks makes great movies, but I can't say they're nearly as iconic as Pixar. And so the character design is a little bit lacking. It also doesn't always fit with the background. So the background is just so photorealistic. There's some landscapes that you don't even know if they look like they're real. Like they don't even look animated. So the characters are a little bit gummy comparatively, if that makes any sense. They're definitely very, very cartoony. Additionally, along with characters, the voice acting is nothing to rave about, I would say. It's not bad by any means. I think there's this tendency now in Hollywood to get more notable actors, so it's easier to market their movie. And I think that has always been the case. There have been notable actors in a lot of different Pixar movies, but they also have always had seasoned voice actors because it's a very different profession. It's definitely hard to translate one to the other. And so there isn't that level of rich voice acting as much as I would like. The one standout, the one exception to that would be Octavia Spencer. Octavia Spencer is really, really great, and she shows off how talented her acting chops are. And I also think her character is one of the most interesting characters, called the Manticore. Basically, the Manticore is this mythical being that could save the world and was strong and a great warrior, but now she's sort of reserved and resorted to an easy waitressing income and sort of a gimmick, kind of like Chuck E. Cheese. And she is the biggest translation, I think, into the wider moral of the film, which is one moral that I really, really like. And that's another big positive for this movie, is that the moral and message of the movie is kind of feeling inadequate. And so that definitely will translate to young kids, because when you're growing up, it's harder to fit in and you don't know where you are. You don't even know who you are yet. So it's just so difficult. And then as an adult, sometimes you can fall into this level of complacency where you don't know if this is where you should be or what you should be doing. And that can make you feel inadequate. And so this movie, particularly that character of the Manticore, who is, in my opinion, the most interesting character, gives that message a great voice and a really good example, because that definitely comes to play with Ian and Barley, but they're a much more stereotypical stock sort of title character, main character, so it's not quite as interesting. But they have that going on too, particularly with Barley, who's played by Chris Pratt, is sort of the goofy older brother and gets on the case of Ian, but ultimately didn't get the same level of education or the same level of care maybe, and so he doesn't necessarily feel like he's even good enough for certain people. So it's something that is easily translatable, I think, to anybody. And there is one level of the movie that it is kind of about a father-son bond, which, if there's any criticism for Pixar as a whole, is almost every movie. There's at least any family dynamic movie, it's almost always a father and a son, which is not a knock at this particular movie. Not even a knock at any other Pixar movies, but it just is definitely something to be a little bit aware of. This time, I think it works even better. And the reason for that being is because in the past, it's been a father who is relevant, or at least in that child's life. Here, the father is gone, and Ian didn't even know the father, which is a very important story to be telling to young kids, because of the fact that there are so many kids who grow up either without one parent or a child of divorce. And so saying that, hey, you can make it through this, and you're just as important and just as adequate, even if you didn't have this important figure that a lot of other kids have, I think is a really important message to be showing to kids. And I really, really like that they went that route with this movie, because it's not an easy thing to do, and it's not really, or it's just very, very hard. For adults in particular, I like that this has that message, and additionally, with it being a Pixar movie, you can do that message in another movie, but having this outlet also gives you that level of positivity and that level of whimsicality that I think is lost among certain adults. I think you gain that back somewhat. I don't have kids, I can't say necessarily, but you at least see the world through their eyes a little bit. But sometimes that's lost, and there's just this aura of pessimism or just melancholy, and I think this has a benefit to anybody, even if you don't have kids. It gives you that level of whimsicality, particularly with the world that it's set in. It is literally a whimsical, magical world, which that part I think does translate to the story and is really important to be shown here. As far as a movie as a whole, I think, like I said, super enjoyable, and the structure gives into that. And like I said, because my expectations were potentially a little bit lower, I was very pleasantly surprised. And I think the thing that surprised me the most is how good the third act is. So the third act is super exciting and very intense. I think that's probably a byproduct a little bit of the superhero genre and the fact that that's just the most marketable blockbuster, particularly because Disney owns both Pixar and Marvel. They know what they're doing, and I think that is something that kids can relate to, at least seeing, and is the most exciting thing to be showing to kids. And it works here because of the fact that that level of intensity and big grandiose ending is kind of a staple of the magic genre, like that. And that caught me off guard a little bit. And also in the third act is where Pixar really shines through most of the time, because Pixar is just so synonymous with that like tearjerker moment. And you definitely have that in this movie. There is that moment of like, we're going to get a tear out of you, which I didn't personally cry. I don't think I cried in this movie, but it definitely got me. Oh, maybe I did. Okay. It definitely got me a little bit. The only thing that I will say about it is that it's a little bit heavy handed. I think Pixar might fall into this trap of, we need to have that moment. It doesn't feel out of place here, but it is sort of like, okay, here's the tearjerker moment. You know it's coming, and it makes a lot of sense, and it's a really great message to be showing to kids, and I think and even to adults. It's a really great message to be showing to everybody. If anything, I think it's just a bit heavy-handed, maybe a little bit, but it's not out of place. It works totally well, and it's a different climax than a lot of movies. It doesn't have the same level of the same story dynamics going on as a lot of Pixar movies. So let's see, what do I think as a whole? I've said a lot of things. What do I think as a whole? I will say that I was pleasantly surprised. It's an enjoyable movie the entire time. I'm really happy that it's an original movie, if anything, because the other reason why I don't necessarily, or I'm a little bit more skeptical of Pixar movies going in now, is because half of their movies are sequels, and that's not necessarily bad. I think if you have another story to tell, particularly with like Toy Story has, maybe not Toy Story 4, but Toy Story 1, 2, and 3 have like a specific story to be told, and as far as I'm aware, that was the intention from the start. But Pixar is really just good at making all these worlds, so that's what you want to see. And so when you dive back into a world, particularly with something like Finding Dory and The Incredibles, where it's like 5 to 15 years later, like that was, first of all, almost clearly never the intention, and second of all, it's just not as compelling. You've already told the story that you want to tell, and unless you have a very distinct story that needs to be told in that world, it's not quite as good. And it can still be a good kids movie, but I think there's a higher standard that Pixar has, that audiences have for Pixar, and Pixar even has for themselves. There's this thing that's called the 26 rules. I think it's 26. It's in the 20s. Rules of Pixar, where it's like their rules of storytelling. And it's great for anybody who wants to be a storyteller. I highly recommend taking a look at it. But it's just their standards for storytelling, and that doesn't always translate to some of their sequels, and it just kind of feels like a good kids movie, but it's not just as good or well-rounded a movie. I mean, Up was nominated for Best Picture at the Oscars. Like, they just really know what they're doing with their films and can be enjoyable to everybody. And so this one in particular, I think, was super fun, super enjoyable. It's a great family movie. Definitely watch it with your family if you have time and you want to watch something new. It has a really fun message. I think if you really want to think more deeply about it and more critically about it, there are some fun little themes going on of the place for spirituality and tradition, and where you should be implementing imagination in your world, and that there is a place for innovation and convenience and technology, and that's really, really important. But there's also a level of importance that goes with things like I said, like tradition and other things that aren't necessarily as physical and might even make your life harder in some regards. So that's what I have to say about this movie. I think it's super fun. I enjoyed it a lot. I would say that if you have Disney Plus and you haven't seen some of the earlier Pixar movies with your family, I would maybe do some of those. It would go a little bit lower on the totem pole of Pixar movies, but it definitely is better than a lot of their sequels. So as original movies go, a little bit lower, but as far as Pixar goes, probably right in the middle of the pack. So I would give this one, I would say, a strong 6 out of 10. So it's not, like I said, not bad by any means. Definitely super fun and enjoyable. And I emphasize strong because maybe it's not quite a 7, but it's not necessarily a 6 either. So strong 6 out of 10. But yeah, that's what I thought of Onward. You can rent that for free on Disney Plus, or stream it for free on Disney Plus, or you can rent it at any other place that you watch movies with your family. Watch it at home, and make sure you stay tuned for the rest of the episode. We're going to take a little bit of a quick break, but coming up, I'm going to talk about The Invisible Man, which is available to rent on digital anywhere that you rent movies, and then I'm going to be talking about Emma, and then stay tuned until the very end, where I give my top 10 movies streaming on Netflix, which I am super, super excited about. So make sure you stay tuned for that. We're going to take a little break.
Want to know the latest and hottest music hitting the airwaves? Don't be left out. Listen to the Golden State Media Concepts Music Podcast. Keith keeps you on the loop with everything you need to know from pop, rock, hip-hop, and the top 40. And we'll throw in news of your favorite artists, concert and tour dates, and so much more. Listen no further, because this is the gold standard in music podcast.
Welcome back to the GSMC Movie Podcast. I'm your host, Casey Baum, and if you're just tuning in, I just recapped my thoughts and feelings about Onward, the newest Disney Pixar film. And for the rest of the episode, right now, I'm going to be talking about The Invisible Man, the newest Universal monster movie. Then I'm going to be talking about Emma, an adaptation of the Jane Austen book, and make sure you stay tuned until the very end, where I give my top 10 list of movies currently streaming on Netflix. But right now, we're talking about The Invisible Man. So I'm going to just get into it. I'm going to start talking about it because I am ecstatic to talk about this movie. I really, really loved this movie. I was really happy with it. I wouldn't say I was pleasantly surprised because I just didn't know what to think going into it. I had no idea if it was going to be good or not, but needless to say, I absolutely loved it. So I'm going to give a brief synopsis first, because then I'm going to go pretty in-depth with it, and it's a little bit different than you might be expecting if you are familiar with the short story or the movie from the 30s, or even just the depiction of the classic Universal monster. So this version of the film follows Cecilia as she tries to get out of an abusive relationship with her boyfriend. She finally does, and then it is revealed that her boyfriend commits suicide. And he is a tech genius, so he has lots and lots of money, and his brother, who's a lawyer, says that Cecilia is being granted that money as long as she is proven clinically sane. But what is revealed, not a spoiler, this is literally part of the synopsis, so don't worry, that he staged his own suicide and created a tech suit that makes himself invisible and decides to stalk and make his ex-girlfriend completely paranoid. And so then she would be revealed to not be clinically sane and would not get that money. So it's definitely a little bit heavy, a little bit hard to watch sometimes, but it is a great movie. It is a great horror movie and a great new reimagining of the classic monster, which is super, super fun. Well, maybe not fun. It's scary. It's enjoyable. I'll say that, because I was terrified watching this movie. So I said that Onward was the last movie that I watched before quarantine. This was the second to last movie that I watched, I think, before quarantine. So I watched this one in theaters, and I actually think, well, I'll say this first. So I was terrified. I watched it with a friend, and at the time, so I have a roommate, but at the time he had gone home to quarantine, and I was living alone. And because this movie follows an invisible man who stalks and tortures somebody, living alone was not necessarily the ideal position to be in when I came home. And I also watched this, I think we went to like a 10 o'clock showing, just because that was the only showing that was like not sold out, I think, maybe. But so I got home late, and I was already scared for the movie, and it's about something that you can't see, so plausibly it could have been in my room. And I literally like would walk into the bathroom, and I have a pretty small bathroom, so I would just like wave my hands around and make sure I didn't physically touch anything. So I was really, really scared. And I think that watching this movie on digital at your own house would only emphasize the fear factor and the story. So I actually think it benefits from watching it at home. So this is probably one of my biggest recommendations for watching the film at home. So let's get started on talking about the movie itself. It's directed by Leigh Whannell, who is known most notably for his recent sort of indie body horror movie Upgrade, but it's most notably produced by Jason Blum, who is the CEO of Blumhouse Productions, and you might know them for producing the Oscar winner Get Out. Blumhouse is a super interesting production studio. Oh, it's also produced by Universal, but that's because it's a Universal property, and I'll go into that in just a second. But Blumhouse is a super interesting model for filmmaking, and it's also just a super interesting production company, because Jason Blum basically started wanting to make horror movies, and they're all, I believe, standalone horror movies. So it kind of implies that it's not a part of a series or shared universe. He just wants to make really good, but more importantly, impactful horror movies. Because when I first heard about them, I can't remember when they kind of came to pass. I think it was early 2010s. They were making like really schlocky, cheesy B-movie horror movies. So it was like not good, and it's like fun. I liked watching some of them, but they were definitely just super, super cheesy. And then I think just it was Get Out that really catapulted them as being, they were only one of the producers. They weren't the sole producer of that movie, but now they have a little bit of credibility, and they're making some really good movies. And more importantly, they're making some good choices. So this movie is a great choice because it's a Universal monster movie. And if you know anything about the Universal monsters, they're extremely iconic. And if you're a fan of shared universes and like Marvel MCU, they were kind of the first shared universe. I remember watching this at a sleepover, but there's a Abbott and Costello like special. I think it's Abbott and Costello meet Frankenstein and the Wolfman. And I think they also all appeared in like other versions of the movie. So like Frankenstein, Dracula, Wolfman, Invisible Man. the Mummy. And so this is important now because of the format of the shared universe with Marvel. Universal kind of wanted to capitalize on that, so they started trying to do a shared universe, which they have not. I assume because you may not know this, they did not have the same level of success that Marvel did. So they started that with I, Frankenstein, which came out in 2014. Aaron Eckhart, I didn't see it, so I won't say my opinion, but it did not get very good reviews. And they kind of backtracked that one a little bit and decided to start with Dracula Untold. Did see that one, was not very good. And so then they were like, okay, let's just go all out. Let's do a big thing. And so they did Tom Cruise with The Mummy. I'm sure you probably have heard of that movie. And that one also, it did well enough at the box office, but it didn't get the critical success and just really couldn't get the whole shared universe thing up and running for Universal, even though it's a fun concept, I think, for them. Luckily, though, that is of the benefit to this movie because originally Johnny Depp was casted as the Invisible Man, so it probably would have had a very, very different story because you would have wanted to get a little bit more of Johnny Depp in there given his star power, and this movie really doesn't have much of the Invisible Man itself. It really centers around Elizabeth Moss's character, and she gives a fantastic performance. She's just tortured and, like, you can see everything going on, like, in her mind when you're watching her on screen, and her escalation, the escalation of the movie itself is really, really great, but her escalation as a character, particularly somebody who might have some version of PTSD or something along those lines, and not really being believed by a lot of people, which I think is a sentiment that is shared by among a lot of survivors, which it's really interesting to listen to Leigh Whannell talk about this because the movie is pretty clearly a metaphor, symbol for abuse and manipulation and survivors in some regards to domestic or romantic relationships. And so that's something that I would say is important to go into this movie because it is something that might be a little bit more serious for certain people to talk about and might be hard to handle. It's dealt with very, very well, but Leigh Whannell talks about it as if he's saying that it's not really his place to comment on it. He's just kind of making he's using film as an outlet to express what it is, not necessarily what it is about. And so he's letting Elizabeth Moss take that psychology and run with it, and then also for any viewer to implant their own ideas onto the film, which I think is a really important thing for filmmakers to be doing anyway, and a lot of the best filmmakers know that. So Leigh Whannell definitely knows what he's doing, and this film takes a really, really important, relevant idea and puts it into a classic movie. And I personally, so I'll give a little bit of my opinion here on adaptations. I love adaptations, but I know that this might be a little bit controversial, but an adaptation is specifically, or a story is specifically made for that medium. So if it's in a book, it's used for language, a lot of internal monologues. If it's a comic book, it's used for images, the panels, the jump scares, whatever. TV, longer format, film has its own specific language. So when you're adapting it into another medium, you have to take that story and translate it to how it would work in that medium. So if you do it word for word, shot for shot, it's not going to be as strong as it could be. And particularly for something as beloved as The Invisible Man, or just beloved as these monster movies, doing the same thing again with modern technology might be cool, but the 30s movie still holds up pretty well. And so adapting it to be more relevant and more reflective of today's sort of ideals is really important. And following Cecilia, the girlfriend of the Invisible Man, I think makes for a way more interesting, way more compelling story, and way scarier. So the Invisible Man is barely in this movie. You get a little bit of a hint of who he is in the beginning. That the opening scene is extremely tense. One of the most suspenseful scenes of the entire movie. The entire movie is suspenseful, but that scene in particular, where she's trying to escape him because they're still in that relationship, is heart pounding. It is very very hard to watch. And so the rest of the movie follows suit. So you get a taste of how he is, how controlling he is. So you already know how scary he is, and then you can't even see him. And so you get a lot of these things of like, is he there? Do you know if he's there? There's these wide shots that are used where you just find yourself scanning the scene, whether or not there's a person even in it, where you're like, okay, is there a hint of the Invisible Man? Is he here? Is he not? The one thing that I wish would have happened is I wish it would have been a little bit more ambiguous earlier as to whether or not the Invisible Man was even real. Because in the world of the film, people don't know that he faked his own suicide. So that, I think, happens in about the first 20 minutes of the movie. So, but within the first scene where you're alone with Elizabeth Moss, you see things happening that wouldn't obviously be happening if there wasn't somebody there. So it's not, in the lens of the film, it's not ambiguous as to whether or not he faked his own suicide. I wish there had been a couple more scenes where you, the audience, are grappling with whether or not you should believe Elizabeth Moss's character or whether you should be going with it, because that, I think, would have been a really interesting thing to reflect on as a viewer. But it doesn't necessarily take away from it, because I think the first scene with the Invisible Man is really, really great. And there's some really great visual effects that are used. It's really simplistic visual effects, which is really nice. It doesn't necessarily seem like a big action blockbuster where it's like a Marvel movie or a Star Wars movie where it's like thrown in your face that it's CGI. It's clearly CGI because there are things happening that you can't see anybody doing them, but it's simplistic. It's really, really, it's not, okay, I wouldn't say it's easy to do those things, but it's not flashy, if anything. So it's just really nice that it's a pretty simplistic, streamlined story and that, visual effects, and that goes along with the story. So the movie itself feels super simplistic and very, very claustrophobic. So you get a lot of these wide shots, but you're also with Elizabeth Moss's character the entire time. And a lot of the settings that happen throughout the movie are very claustrophobic and very small spaciously. So realistically, if the Invisible Man is in that room, there's only one or two places for him to be. And so you kind of are scanning to see if he is actually there. So it's simple, it's claustrophobic, and it's very, very suspenseful the entire time. As far as a horror movie goes, it is excellent. It's scared the crap out of me. There are two, I think, really, really great jump scares. I know that jump scares get a bad rep as being cheap, because I think they can be cheap and gimmicky. Like, you know when they're coming. It's like, okay, the music is swelling, or the music is swelling and then it stops and then there's like a thud or something. So you kind of know when they're coming and then it'll still scare you. So it's just a cheap way to get a reaction. But these certain movies, I think, when you have a really talented director or a really talented just production team, you get these jump scares that are really effective in the world of the movie. And there's one in particular that really, really got me and is terrifying. It like gives you that sense of, oh, it's claustrophobic. The monster is closer than you think they might be. And then it's a little bit of a jump scare, but it's more of just how jarring the scene is. There's a scene about halfway through the movie that I will say I was not expecting at all. It came out of nowhere, and I will make the grand statement, because there aren't as many movies that I've seen this year based on COVID, that is my favorite scene in a movie this year. It is shocking. It's extremely well done. It's relevant to the story. I think it's absolutely excellent. So I said earlier with the visual effects, those work really well. And because of that, there are also some fun visual gags that you get. If you've seen the trailer, there's this shot of Elizabeth Moss outside where she's in the cold because she thinks that somebody might be there outside. There's like a knock on the door or something, and you see the breath coming out of her, and so you can see her breath. And then next to her, you see another set of the breath, but there's nobody there. So there are some little I call them gags, because it's sort of like the line of horror and comedy is like pretty close. I think that's just the only little that's what you could call it. And it's used really, really well and really effectively. There are some things with like a chair and a carpet, and they just are very creative with how they show you where the Invisible Man is, with it very clearly not showing you where the Invisible Man is. So I really, really liked that. Along with the visual effects, the set design is really, really, I guess I kind of said this earlier, so this is, I'll brush past this, but the set design is really nice with how small everything feels, and that goes along with the characters too. So there's really only, not including the Invisible Man, because he's almost an entity. Like he's definitely puts the term monster into perspective. Like it's not even human at that point. So not including him, there are pretty much 3 central characters, where it's Elizabeth Moss's character, her sister, played by Harriet Dyer, and her friend. It's like either a friend from college or hometown. I don't know if I can quite remember, but that is played by Aldous Hodge, who I would have to say he is excellent. And then he has a young daughter who is looking to go to college, played by Storm Reed, who was also in Euphoria, if anybody has watched that, and she's also excellent. So that little ensemble cast is really, really good and really, really likable. I love the dynamic of the friends. I really like when a horror movie can get you invested in the characters, because then it can do anything. Like it can mess with, torture the characters anyway, and it'll be scary because you're so connected to those characters. So I like that ensemble cast. I really like the acting is excellent. Like I said, Elizabeth Moss is great. The only thing with Elizabeth Moss is that I worry that she might be tipping into the realm of getting typecasted. She plays a similar sort of at least similar in not message, but like overall tone. So if anybody who doesn't know who she is the lead in Handmaid's Tale. So that's what I'm referencing here. It's a similar role. Obviously, The Handmaid's Tale is a little bit more complex because you just get more time with her. But I would definitely say that there is the threat of her being typecasted in this sort of like psychologically damaged woman who is like going a little bit stir crazy. So, but that's not a knock at her, because she's extremely good at it, and she's also very talented in other films. If you've seen her in Us, like she knows how to do other things. That's not a knock at her. I just worry that casting directors might see her that way and might end up getting typecasted like that. As far as the film goes, other than the use of wide shots, the cinematography is not quite as special, or it's just nothing special. Same with the score. It's an overarching sort of creepy violin type score. So nothing special, but what it lacks in, that doesn't take away anything from the movie, don't get me wrong, but what it lacks in that, it gains in sound design. The sound design is excellent. I mainly make note of that because the suit is like a tech, because he's a tech genius, it's very technology oriented. That's how the suit is being made. And so the sound of the suit, you get a sense of where he might be based on that. And it's a very creative sound. And then throughout the movie, you see how the suit, eventually you can get to know how the suit works. And that sound really, really makes sense for it. So I think that's great. The movie itself escalates excellently. It starts out simple, like I said, and then it becomes a much, much more grandiose movie. The gore, it's not gory necessarily. It's definitely a little bit bloody, but nothing overly gross. But that escalates pretty well too. It starts out without any of that, and then eventually gets into a little bit more of a violent finale, like most horror movies. But I think what stands out the most in this movie is just the overall story being told and how the reimagining really fits. It has just the central direction of central vision of just one director, and the story about manipulation and isolation and abuse, and how people might not believe her, and she's not getting the help, and she needs to take it into her own hands. And then there's also the level of manipulating the other people around her, whether or not it's the Invisible Man or just somebody else that she knows. And so I really, really like that aspect of it. It has a really strong story to tell. The filmmaking and the narrative fit that and emphasize it extremely, extremely well. And then it set that tone, and that message sets up the finale, and particularly the final scene, really, really well, and kind of turns it on its head. So I am super excited about how happy I am with this movie. I love horror movies, and this is just a really great reimagining of it. So like I said, there's a couple things that maybe could have been better. Doesn't take anything away from the movie, but doesn't enhance it in any way. But I really just want to give kudos to the script and how well this thing is directed, produced, and the story being told. So I'm going to give this one a solid 8 out of 10. It's very, very strong, very enjoyable. If you like horror movies and are willing to be scared for a good long time, especially if you're alone at home, or just at home in general. So make sure you're ready for that. So those are my thoughts on The Invisible Man, and we're going to take a little bit of a quick break right now, but make sure you stay tuned for the next movie that I talk about, which is Emma, and then keep listening till the very, very end, where I talk about my top 10 movies streaming on Netflix right now. So we're going to take a quick break.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Welcome back to the GSMC Movie Podcast. I'm your host, Casey Baum, and if you are just tuning in, I have previously given my thoughts about Onward, the newest Disney and Pixar film, as well as The Invisible Man, the newest film from Universal Studios and Blumhouse Productions. And right now, I'm going to be talking about Emma, which is available to rent right now on most streaming services. And stay tuned until the very end, where I talk about my top 10 movies that are currently streaming on Netflix. You can watch all of those for free, and I am super excited to talk about that list. But right now, I'm super excited to talk about Emma, because I know that I talked extensively and raved about The Invisible Man. I love The Invisible Man. I think that this movie is the best of the bunch that I'm reviewing right now. I may have subjectively enjoyed The Invisible Man a little bit more and liked a lot of the choices that were made, but I think that in a more holistic, objective sense, Emma is a little bit better, and I think I like it a little bit better as well. So for those of you who are unfamiliar, Emma is an adaptation of a Jane Austen novel, one of her most famous stories, and it follows Emma, who pretty obviously, who is a young girl, I believe 21, at least in the film, living in 1800s, 19th century England. She's very rich, very posh, and it basically follows her escapades as she meddles in the love lives of those around her and tries to find love herself. So definitely a fun little story going on there, and I really enjoyed it. I knew a little bit going into this. The extent of what I knew about the story was from Clueless, because if you don't know, Clueless from the 90s is based on Emma, and I knew that, and I love Clueless. It's one of my favorite movies. In watching Emma, it's definitely fairly different. I now understand what's going on with the adaptation, and I think it's a great adaptation. Like I said in my previous segment on my opinions on adaptations, I think they do a great job, and Emma does a lot of similar things to Clueless, and some of the reasons that I like Clueless so much, Emma also incorporates into this film. I was a little bit skeptical going into this. I have said that, at least for Onward. I don't think I had thought that for Invisible Man. But the theme for today is how excited I am at how good these movies are. I'm just an excitable person. But these movies in particular, I was either skeptical or just didn't know anything about. And I think part of that is because early on in the year, except for March for some reason, I've found, but a lot of early movies within the calendar year are not quite to the caliber as later in the year. So like summer is where a lot of those big blockbusters come in, which is always really enjoyable. And then towards the end of the year, fall, winter is when we get those award season movies that are usually really, really good. And so early on, unless you're coming out of a film festival like Sundance, which happens in January, there's usually not very many good movies that come out. So I was very pleasantly surprised with Emma. In particular, I think it's from the trailer. I don't know what it was. This is just me personally. There was something a little bit just off-putting about the trailer. Like it was just a little bit weird, and it didn't give a good background on what the actual story of the movie was. It definitely gives a good sense of what the tone is. The tone is very similar, and it just kind of felt like it was a little bit of a, not knockoff, but a little bit of a weaker version of some movies coming out right now. And I say that because there's a lot of really good period pieces that are coming out right now. Because another reason, much like Onward, period pieces are not always my favorite. It's not an aesthetic that I'm all that interested in. It always just feels very like uncomfortable. Like I relate to the characters because that's what you're supposed to do, but I never actually feel like I would want to live there. And that's something that Emma does really well. And it's the new crop of period pieces seem to be doing that really well, that it actually feels very livable. Like you would actually either want to or could make do living in that era. What comes to mind in particular is Little Women. I think Little Women from last year really, really nails that. And then additionally, Portrait of a Lady on Fire, which came out of France and is currently on Hulu, does that pretty well too, that you actually feel like you could live there. And like I said, Emma does that great. All of the emotions that she's going through, all of the things that she's doing feels very, very relatable. And a lot of that is kudos to Anya Taylor-Joy, who plays Emma. She's in every scene of this movie, I believe. I mean, it's literally the titular role, and she nails it. She is a powerhouse in this movie. I think the thing that stood out the most to me with her is her facial expressions. So with period pieces, there's I think a couple minutes, definitely the first 15 beginning of the movie, where you really have to adapt with what's going on, particularly if it's spoken in not old English, but like older vernacular. So it's like you have to kind of adapt to what they're saying. And eventually you get into it, but early on, you really have to look at the acting and look at the facial expressions to see what they're really thinking so you can actually understand what's going on and then immerse yourself later on in the film. Anya Taylor-Joy is amazing at that. Like every small shot with her, you can see exactly what's going on in her head, the intricacies of her face. I honestly don't know how she did it in some regards. It's just so subtle. The little minute movements of her eyes and her mouth. Like she is fantastic in this. A lot of times acting is kind of boiled down to like how well you can say a role, or how well you can cry on command. And she does that very well in this movie too. But I think the thing that really stood out to me from her were those the really minute intricacies in her facial features and her facial expressions. That's also pretty relevant because that's one of the things that was happening with the camera that I really, really liked in this movie. The camera was really close a lot of the times. It was very, very intimate. There's almost no over-the-shoulder shots or two shots. So anytime that there's a close-up in a movie, the traditional standard for that is to have the shoulder of the person who is being addressed also in the shot, so you get a sense that there's two people in the scene. But strategically, a shot where it's just the person's face can be used because it'll usually feel a little bit more intimate, a little bit more uncomfortable sometimes. It's just not as familiar, and you have to really confront what's going on with the actor's face. And that's almost exclusively how they shoot dialogue scenes in this movie, which I found very, very fascinating. It makes you really grapple with because a lot of what's happening in this movie is internal, and a lot of what you can relate to is internal because it takes place in this very like rich and grandiose setting that even somebody back then wouldn't be able to relate to. It's like the uber rich. And so to be able to relate to it, that's a lot of the internal struggle because we all have feelings of love and lust and pining after somebody who might not, unrequited love sort of deal. And so I think the choice to frame the camera in that way where you really have to confront these characters was a really, really smart decision. So the cinematography I actually do really like. And additionally, when it's not that, and it's a shot where it's a couple people, it's a little bit wider. It's usually below their torso, which isn't as common in film. So you see a lot of their body. And then with the wide shots, it was shot in an angle where the depth of field is a lot smaller. And so everything in the background is very out of focus and all of the characters look very small, even though they might be filling up a lot of the screen, which gives you the sense of like a Renaissance painting. And it makes every shot look beautiful and really look like it may have existed back then based on the paintings that we are aware of nowadays. There's also a little bit of a motif of those images. Emma likes to draw, and she likes to paint little pictures of the people that she knows. She calls them impressions of the people, because obviously it wasn't a picture. You couldn't take a picture back then. And so she likes to do that, and so you get a little sense of that's what they were going for with the camera too, which I really, really appreciated. Additionally, with that, there's some great costuming that's going on in this movie. And I think that's usually what is hailed as the crowning achievement for a film like this. Most period pieces tend to be really extravagant with their costumes, and most pull it off very well. But I think what was really interesting about Emma in particular is that it really focused heavily on colors and pastels. And so a lot of these period pieces, again, bringing to light Little Women, are a lot of browns, a lot of darker colors like browns and whites, and those sorts of monotone colors. This one has a lot of very vibrant pastels, particularly a very interesting use of complementary colors. So I noticed a lot of Emma wearing a lot of purples and yellows, which are complementary and correspond with each other. A lot of greens and reds that also appear both in the set and in the costuming. And I think that does a really good job taking the themes of the movie, with people grappling with not being able to communicate well with each other. And so but they all live together, and they all have to deal with each other and technically complement each other pretty well as far as their status and their emotions. And so there's a little bit of that disconnect, but they're also supposed to be together, and they work well together. And so I think that's sort of where the coloring was coming from, at least in my own personal interpretation. A lot of those things are up for interpretation. So that happened in the costuming. It also happens a lot in the set design. So the set design is super lavish and grandiose. I know I watched this last night, so this is very fresh in my mind, which I think is why I'm going so intricate into this movie. But my mom was like, we should live in a house like that, because it's something that everybody wants. It's a house that everybody would want to live in. It's massive. It's like an estate. And then they're walking around in these like beautiful green fields that are probably acres on acres on acres. And even when they go into somebody who might be a little bit more poor, that area of town, it's still this pretty grandiose setting, or at least like idealistic for a modern audience to look back at that time period. So that's something that props to the prop committee who did that, and made everything look really beautiful. And they did it really well with all the colors. So I think I would say it's better than a lot of different period pieces. I think Little Women won best costuming at the Oscars this year, and I have to say that I think that this one might be a little bit better, a little bit more interesting, especially with Emma's character. I mean, you focus on her the entire movie, but I really like all of her costuming. She has a lot of cool stuff with collars and stuff, and pops of color, which was really, really fun. So the movie itself is adorable. Oh my God. It's literally so cute. That's like my main takeaway from this movie, is how cute it was. It took me a minute to get into it. Like I said, that's sort of the just nature of getting immersed. It's like watching a Shakespeare. It's like you're not going to understand Shakespearean language right off the bat. But once you really get into it, it will become a little bit more effortless throughout the movie. So early on, I was a little bit nervous, because I was like, I don't really know what's going on. And I was like pretty much basing everything that I knew from the story on Clueless. I was like, okay, so she's Cher, there's no Dion in this movie, she's Paul Rudd. Like, and so I didn't know who was who or what the relationships were right off the bat. But regardless, it was still very quaint and very cutesy. And then the rest of the movie really focuses in on Emma's relationship with a lot of these people, and there's this air of awkwardness throughout the movie that I really enjoyed. That's pretty uncommon, I think, for period pieces, because there's this notion that like if you existed back then, because of the fact that it was so proper and performative, that you couldn't slip up, or nobody thought that you could be insecure or awkward. And this kind of throws that out the window. There's all of these instances, and if you watch the trailer, you'll get that pretty quickly. But there's all these instances that are just kind of odd and like, ugh, like a little bit cringeworthy, or at the very least you're like, oh, okay, that could have been handled a little bit better. And it creates for some really fun comedy, especially early on where you're not necessarily immersed in the world fully yet. So I really enjoyed that. There are some laugh out loud moments. I mean, with everybody's facial expressions are great in this movie. That's one of my favorite parts of the acting. But there are some story-based jokes that just keep the narrative going that are very, very funny. And I think the awkwardness just lends itself to creating that form of comedy that fits really well into this movie, because Emma is so, as a character, she's really not very likable. She's rich and she's arrogant and she's selfish, but she's our main character, so we're following her. So whenever she gets a little bit of her comeuppance or just gets poked fun at in any way, you're like, oh, okay, cool. And that's the form of comedy that they go for, and keeping it in that awkward vein. The characters are really great in this movie. I think one of the reasons I was so happy with Anya Taylor-Joy's performance, joyful with Joy's performance, she makes this unlikable character sympathetic, and you are really rooting for her throughout most of the movie. And there comes the lowest low of her story, and you're like, okay, you kind of, maybe you deserve that, and then you want her to improve because you do actually like her as a character. And I think that's props to the writing, but I think it's even more specifically props to Anya Taylor-Joy. So she is by far the standout in this movie, and she's an example of one of the things I like about this movie, that it's a pretty young, or at least not as experienced team, both on the acting side and the production side. I don't know many names in the world of lighting and costuming, so I can't necessarily say that. They may as well be seasoned veterans, because they did a very, very good job. But the writer and the director don't have much under their belt. All of the actors are pretty young or have not done a lot of major projects, except for Papa, is how it's pronounced in the movie, but it's Emma's father, who is played by Bill Nye, not to be confused with the science guy, Bill Nighy, which is a weird spelling. He is a phenomenal actor, and I love him. He's one of my favorite, like, seasoned veteran actors. He was in About Time, and he's by far the best part of that movie. He's not the best part of this movie because he's not in this movie as much. Like I said, Emma is definitely the best part of this movie, but he does a great job. He has some really fun little comedic lines, and I think he spices up all of the scenes that he's in. So I really, really like that. Like I said, I think with the acting is part of the reason why this feels so relatable and it feels so livable. I really felt like I could have, I mean, they're rich, so like, of course you could be rich whenever, but and it's like so nice and polished and whatnot, but I really felt like I related to a lot of the problems that were going on, and that's because of the acting. And I really felt like I could live, or at the very least empathize with what was going on with these characters, which I really, really enjoyed. With the acting, also the chemistry among all of the characters is fantastic. I really don't think you can fake awkwardness. I think you have to like know each other really well so you can create that on screen. And so that the fact that they're so, like, some people are so awkward together, but then also some people just have really, really intense chemistry, whether it's friendship or romance or even hatred in some regards, is great. The chemistry is fantastic in this movie. So you really, all of the scenes are super enjoyable to watch. And that's also because of the pacing of this movie. The pacing is fantastic. I thought it started out a little bit slow, and that's just because it took me a minute to get immersed into it. And then throughout it really picks up the pace. And it's a 2-hour movie. It doesn't really feel like a 2-hour movie. It feels like it's kind of gone by like that. And each scene kind of ramps up. It's told in chapters, quote unquote. It's told in regards to like spring, autumn, summer, that kind of thing. And I love movies that are told in chapters. Maybe it's a little bit pretentious, but I just think it's like really fun, and you like, okay, now it's like you're aware of the structure, which was great. So the writing, I think, was awesome because the pacing just really flows naturally into the film. And with the writing as well, I think the subtext is really, really well done. It's pretty easy and this is not a knock. It's really pretty easy for you to understand what they're talking about when they're not actually talking about it. So the subtext is done really well. I don't know if this is the case in the book because I have not read the book. I assume that it is, given that books can be fleshed out a little bit more sometimes. There's hints at sort of grander themes throughout the movie. There's hints at like depression and other things like that. And it's just sort of a hint. It's not explicitly stated. And I kind of like that. And it is great for the subtext, and it's great to kind of just enhance the movie itself. There's also these little moments that once you get immersed into it, you're like, okay, you feel like it's happening now, or you feel like you understand that, and it feels very relatable and almost modern. But there are these points in the movie that kind of take you out of it, where you're like, oh, right, this is taking place in the 19th century. So like, there's a moment where it snows and everybody freaks out because like if they could die in the snow, like they might not get back, or at one point a baby gets somewhat sick and they don't know if it's like a deadly disease. Like it can't just be a cold. If it was just a cold, the baby could bite it. Like there's these moments where you're like, oh, right, this does take place without modern medicine or without cars, So I like that a lot. So I've raved a lot about this movie, very clearly. I think the only knock would be it's very, very Wes Anderson inspired, which is obviously not a bad thing. Wes Anderson is a great director, and there's some inspirations that can be taken there. But it's so apparent that it almost feels like a ripoff. There are some things that are done a little bit differently. I'd say it's not quite as cartoonish or comical. And I like the awkwardness in the writing that is also very Wes Anderson inspired, but it's definitely a little bit different here. So there's a little bit of that going on with the cinematography and the set design in particular. But I would say that's kind of the only major knock that I have for it. So it's a little bit slow in the beginning, but it picks up, and the ending is fantastic. And then all of the acting and all of the different production notes, like I said. So I would give this one a soft 9. So it's very high up there. Not quite a perfect movie, but pretty close. And I would recommend watching this one because I don't think it benefited from quarantine. It was marketed very, very heavily, particularly where I was watching movies. I saw the trailer of pretty much every movie that I went to. And it's the kind of movie that really needs to get a good theatrical release to make money. It's not a big blockbuster. It's not a big family-friendly movie, even though it is PG. It needs to get that wider release so as many people can see it. And so when quarantine happened, this had come out right before quarantine, I think in a couple different cities. And so seeing it at home, you don't lose anything. It's not necessarily a theater movie, but the filmmakers, I feel like, might have lost a little bit as far as financially and just people talking about it. So I would definitely recommend supporting this movie. It's very, very good. You're putting your money in a good place. You're supporting some really good filmmaking. So I really liked this one. But right now we're going to take one more quick break. But when we come back, make sure you stay because I get to talk about literally my favorite thing ever, just some of my favorite movies when I count down my top 10 movies to stream for free right now on Netflix. So make sure you stay tuned for that.
Watching TV has changed over time. Streaming has become the new norm. That's why Golden State Media Concepts television podcast dives headfirst to the world of cord cutting. Want to be on the loop of what's hot in Netflix? Or if it's not a preference, what about original shows in Hulu? We've got you covered. Join us as we fill in the blank and talk about movies to stream and what show you should be binging. This is the Golden State Media Concepts television podcast.
All right, welcome back to the GSMC Movie Podcast. I'm your host, Casey Baum, and if you are just tuning in, I have talked about my thoughts and feelings on Onward, the newest Disney Pixar film, The Invisible Man, the newest Universal and Blumhouse film, and Emma, the newest film based on the Jane Austen novel. So now is my favorite part of the show. I am so very excited to be counting down my top 10 movies that are streaming for free on Netflix. So this is because a lot of us are still in quarantine, and even if you're not, it's always nice to find some free movies to stream. And a lot of the movies that are on Netflix that are not Netflix originals don't necessarily get the same amount of buzz or the same amount of love, or people don't even know that they're on Netflix necessarily. So I have looked through my favorite movies, seen which ones are on Netflix, and I'm going to count them down right now. And I love top 10 lists. I hope that you do too. And I hope you like some of these recommendations. I hope there's something for everybody. I've tried to make this list as diverse as possible. So I've got some family-friendly movies, some scary movies, some lovey-dovey movies. So let's get started. Let's kick it off right now. So I'm counting down from 10 to 1, just so you guys know. I'm saving the best for last, of course. But the first one I saw on Netflix, I think when it first came on Netflix, which was like 2015. So it's been on here for a while, and I think this is the place where most people have seen it. It's called The Babadook. It's a horror movie coming out of Australia. It follows a single mother whose husband passed away as she's raising her young son, who's about 5 or 6, who is kind of a rascal, a little bit reckless, a little bit of an outcast. So he's a little bit hard to handle, and she has to deal with that. And every night she reads him a children's book called The Babadook, who's the scary monster that will come and get you. And she starts to get a little bit paranoid and starts seeing the Babadook everywhere, when her son also starts remarking that the Babadook is kind of around. And so it's this little psychological horror thriller that's really, really pretty scary. I would recommend watching this one with a couple people if you can. It's not necessarily like a fun horror movie. It's very enjoyable, very, very good. There's not really any jump scares. It just really gets into you. There's a couple movies I would say that have really stuck with me post watching them as far as horror movies go. This one is towards the top of that list. It's also towards the top of just my favorite horror movies ever. It's super creative. It's a directorial debut from this woman named Jennifer Kent, who's from Australia. It's based on a short film that she did called The Monster, which I actually think is not quite as good as The Babadook. I think it's definitely very interesting and more startling. There's a couple jump scares in the short film that aren't in the Babadook movie. But the Babadook has some fun things going on with different techniques that are used. There's like stop motion going on. There's a lot of cool set design. The color grading is great. It almost feels like it's in black and white. The accents are fun if you're American like me, where you get to hear some Australian accents. And the ending is a little bit controversial. People don't necessarily like it. I would say it's a little bit more metaphorical than some people might like. Very symbolic. It's one of the reasons that I really, really like this movie. So I recommend this highly if you're a horror fan, if you're a psychological fan, or just if you're a big movie fan. I think it's one of the best horror movies to come out of the 21st century. I think give it a little while, it'll be hailed as one of those horror classics. I think it's really fantastic. And it's free, so why not? Next up is a new addition to Netflix, I believe, or at least I hadn't seen it earlier. And if you want to become a little bit more educated on film, and you've heard the name Bong Joon-ho recently, he won Best Picture and Best Director at this year's Oscars with his newest film, Parasite. He's a Korean director, and he has 2 American films. One of them is a Netflix original. That one is called Okja. Have not seen it, don't know much about it. But the movie that I'm recommending right now is my favorite movie from his, which is called Snowpiercer. So this one is based around a world that it has gone into an icy tundra because of climate change. But before that happened, there was a tech billionaire genius who created a sustainable train that would go around the earth and run on sustainable fuels, so it would just continue running no matter what. And based on the system of the train, the people that are in the back of the train are the poorest, and they get the least food rations, and the people in the front are the richest. And the people in the back don't necessarily know that the people in the front are that rich until they find out towards the beginning of the movie, and Chris Evans leads a revolt to the front of the train. So it's literally a linear movie. It's told like that. Each train car is a little bit different. Each train car adds to the world of the film. It's super interesting. It's based on a graphic novel, I believe, and there's now an American TV show coming out. I don't know much about the American TV show. I would definitely recommend watching this movie first because of how fantastic it is. Bong Joon-ho likes to do movies that are based around class issues, and this one is one of his most interesting ones. I like Parasite almost just as much. I think it might just be because I saw Snowpiercer first or had high expectations for Parasite because I really like Bong Joon-ho. He's one of my favorite directors. And if you've seen Parasite, the class issue is told almost vertically. So it's like the highest are literally high up and the lowest are low. This one is told linearly, horizontally. So from left to right. And that's how the movie is told. That's how the class system works. And there's a lot of just really interesting social issues that are embedded into this movie. The acting is great. The action is awesome. The cinematography is super cool. So could not rave enough about this movie. If you're a comic book fan, if you're an action fan, if you're interested in all of those social things that go on in this movie, definitely recommend. The next movie is a little bit weirder. Not horror, not action. This one is a little bit sci-fi, but it's a romance movie. It's called Her. It stars Joaquin Phoenix, and it's directed by Spike Jonze, who you might know, who also directed Where the Wild Things Are. I really like Where the Wild Things Are. This, I think, is his best movie. It basically follows Joaquin Phoenix in a not-so-distant future where an AI has been created, kind of like Siri, but that can actually have thoughts and emotions, and he gets his installed, and he starts to fall in love with that AI. And so he basically is falling in love with his phone. So it's a little bit weird. It's a little bit odd, but ultimately it's a movie about human connection and romance and what that actually means to be in love with somebody and what that means to really be connected with somebody. It has a great cast. Joaquin Phoenix, Amy Adams, Scarlett Johansson is the voice of that AI system. And I've seen multiple videos about how they did the lighting and the set decoration in the world of futuristic LA that's oversaturated with buildings and has emphasis on Eastern Asian architecture. It has this really great red color palette. Oh, Chris Pratt's in it, which is fun because he wasn't really big at that point. It was like when he was just making his foray into films, like right before Guardians of the Galaxy. And it's just really kind of cute, and it's a little bit melancholy, but I would recommend this one to watch with a partner, or if you want to kind of get in the feels and watch this movie. It's very, very enjoyable. One of my favorite movies ever. Next up is an action movie. This movie might not be for everybody because it's a found footage movie. I really like found footage movies. I think there's a very interesting narrative dynamic that can be used when that happens. This one is one of my favorites, and if it's considered a horror movie, it's the first horror movie I ever saw, I think ever. It's called Cloverfield. So it's directed by J.J. Abrams. You may have heard of 10 Cloverfield Lane if you haven't heard of this one. And then there's one called Cloverfield Paradox, which is a Netflix original, which I do not recommend. It's not a very good movie. But Cloverfield basically follows this group of friends where the main character is leaving for Japan for a job, and his friend, who's played by TJ Miller, who's a comedian, is taping the entire event when there is an explosion. It takes place in Manhattan, New York City, when there's an explosion farther in Manhattan, and things erupt into chaos, and then people start to learn that there is a giant monster that is attacking the city. So it's a monster movie, it's a horror movie, it's found footage, a lot of action. There's some scary scenes, and it's also framed where he is accidentally taping over a beach date with the main character and his ex-girlfriend, who is also in the friend dynamic that's going on. So it's PG-13. I believe it's not super, super gory, but it definitely has that tone that it could be if it wanted to, but it doesn't necessarily need to be. So I think it's a good foray into horror if you're not necessarily a big fan of that but want to be. I love monster creature films. The design of it is great. J.J. Abrams really uses his tactic of hiding the monster for as long as possible. There's some iconic imagery in it. I have the movie poster in my room because it's like the Statue of Liberty with her head cut off. It's a very, very cool looking poster, and I really just love this movie. I think it's a great found footage movie. Number 6 on this list is a Netflix original, and I wanted to put one documentary on this list just in case you're a big documentary fan, and I have recently been getting into documentaries. This one is called 13th. It's directed by Ava DuVernay, and it basically maps the entire prison industrial complex and mass incarceration that really took off in the 80s in the United States, but it kind of explains where it came from after the days of slavery, and then talks about what that means for America right now and where it can go, and just the way that works. It's extremely informative. I knew very little. I mean, I learned about the civil rights movement and slavery in school, but there's a lot of things that are covered in this movie with people who are very, very smart and very esteemed. It's got Van Jones, Newt Gingrich, Angela Davis. It's got lots and lots of people who know exactly what they're talking about. Race professors, law professors, media analysts. So there's a lot of people who know what they're doing. The filmmaking is great. There's a lot of great art that happens. It's very emotional, very, very powerful. There's some really cool music that grounds it to be a little bit more relatable. And I just recommend it for basic information. I think it's things that everybody needs to know, particularly what's going on in the United States right now with a lot of the Black Lives Matter protests, just to get a little bit of framing of understand what's going on and why some of these things may be happening. So it's really great. It's really informative. I would say it's my favorite documentary, probably. I've seen it a couple times. I've never gotten bored. I'm always taking in new things and remembering what's being said in the documentary. So I highly recommend this one if you're a documentary fan or just want to stay aware on social issues. All right, now we're into my top 5 on Netflix. This one, I assume a lot of people have seen, so I'm going to recommend it just in case you haven't seen it, and it is Ferris Bueller's Day Off. It's a little bit older. Teen comedy from the 80s with Matthew Broderick. Basically follows Ferris Bueller, who is this lovable, fun, eccentric character as he skips school and convinces his girlfriend and his best friend to do it with him, and their escapades in Chicago. It's just super fun to watch. It's very funny. If you're a fan of teen comedies, if you're a fan of 80s films, it's kind of the staple of 80s comedies if you're not really looking at John Hughes. Ferris Bueller is just one of my favorite characters ever created. The comedy still holds up really well. It's just super fun. It's a great family movie. So I don't really need to talk much about this movie. People know about it, and I assume a lot of people have seen it. And if you have seen it, watch it again. It's super fun. It'll liven your spirits. It's a great movie, and it's on Netflix. So take a look. Number 4, I've actually already mentioned in this episode because I talked about Emma, and this movie is based on Emma, and it's Clueless. Now we're into my actual top 10 movies that are on Netflix. I love Clueless so much. It just got added. It is my favorite script, I think, maybe ever written. It takes the intricacies of older English language and kind of puts it into modern day slang, so it feels like it could have existed back then, or it's what people might be looking back on this time thinking, what in the world are they saying? But we can kind of understand it because it is slang, but it does sound a little bit weird. And Cher is such an unlikable but enjoyable character to watch. If you don't know what it's about, it follows Cher as the most popular rich high school kid and her friend Dion as they take another young student under their wing as sort of their pet project to make her stylish and popular. And it's just a great teen comedy, a great romance. Paul Rudd is like 20 in this, but he looks exactly the same as he does now. It's a very cute movie. Like I said, my favorite script ever. The costume design, absolutely iconic, absolutely fantastic. I think sometimes movies like this can get hailed as a chick flick because of the fact that it's a primarily female lead cast. It's also directed by a woman, which is really great. Not a lot of major films in Hollywood are directed by women. So this one, and then 13th with Ava DuVernay, definitely support for that reason. And it's one of my favorite movies. It's not a chick flick. It's just a great, great film. So if you haven't seen it, just got added, could not rave enough about this movie. So check out Clueless. Number 3, now we're really into the movies that I could probably talk about for hours on hours on hours. So this one is called Ex Machina. It's a movie from A24, which is a newer production studio that came to pass in 2012, 2013. And this is one of their first really big movies. If you've heard of Moonlight, which won Best Picture, that's them. Ex Machina basically follows, it's basically 3 characters, Domhnall Gleeson, Oscar Isaac, and Alicia Vikander. Domhnall Gleeson's character works for this big tech company, kind of like a Facebook, Google type thing, and he wins a an employee competition where he gets to meet the CEO in his secluded Alaskan house. It's played by Oscar Isaac. He goes and he finds out that Oscar Isaac is trying to create an AI that's an actual robot that has thoughts and feelings, and he tries to implement the Turing test to determine whether or not she would work in an actual society as basically a human. And so that as Ava, which is the robot, is played by Alicia Vikander. It's this really interesting study of what it means to be human, what it means to be almost godlike, to create life. And it's juxtaposed with these beautiful shots of Alaska and the nature that surrounds it. So this one is also told in chapters, like I said, that I love Emma for, which I really like. It's like Ava Session 1, which is super, super cool. I own the script. It's just one. I saw it in theaters knowing literally nothing about it. And I recommend, if you don't know too much about it, just to not look anything up about it. It's great. It's written and directed by Alex Garland, who is one of my current favorite creators, and he just really knows what he's doing. He's written things like 28 Days Later and Sunshine, and he just created a show on Hulu called Devs, which is also very, very cool. Recommend. It's almost a companion piece to Ex Machina as far as tone and message goes. So this one is a psychological thriller that starts kind of just as a basic character study drama. Definitely heightens in intensity. So if you're not necessarily ready for that, I would save it until you're emotionally prepared for that. But there are some really great, deeper themes that go on. It's a very heady movie that you have to think about. And it's just a super simple aesthetic that I really, really like. So one of my favorite movies ever. I'm going to say that for this entire list, but not one that necessarily a lot of people have seen or heard of. So could not recommend Ex Machina enough if you're into psychological thrillers. And now we've got two films that I think are both pretty family friendly, but they're not necessarily kid oriented. They're just like a great watch with other people. This one has been on Netflix for about a year now. It used to be my favorite movie when I was younger. I watched it when I was about 15, which I think was like the perfect time for me to watch it. So if you're in that camp, take a look if you haven't seen it. So this one is called Scott Pilgrim versus the World. Basically follows Scott Pilgrim, who's played by Michael Cera, as he falls in love with this new girl in town, Ramona Flowers, and she says, if you want to date me, you're going to have to defeat my 7 evil exes. And so he has to go through these stages where he physically battles in a very cartoony video game style all of her exes to win her hand, to win her love. So it's super eccentric, super creative. It's based on a graphic novel by Brian Lee O'Malley. Recommend that one as well. They're both very different, but they have the same tone. Stylistically, so much going on. It's super chaotic, but that just enhances the story. It enhances the fun. It's crazy. The comedy is so quick. It's so good. It's directed by Edgar Wright, who also did Baby Driver, and he just knows how to make visual comedy. He knows how to make quick gags. The cast is absolutely stacked with, like I said, Michael Cera, Kieran Culkin, Chris Evans, Jason Schwartzman, Anna Kendrick. I could literally go on and on and on. So amazing cast, amazing acting, laugh out loud funny. I've seen this movie probably upwards of 20 times and I never get tired of it. So if you just want something that's super, super fun to watch, Scott Pilgrim vs. the World is the one to do it with. And finally, number 1 on this list came out last year, so it's brand new, and a lot of people saw it. A lot of people raved about it. It won Best Animated Film at the Oscars, and it is Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse. I love Spider-Man. It is my favorite fictional character, and Spider-Verse, I had expectations that were through the roof for this movie because of the fact that I love Spider-Man, I love animation, and I love superheroes. And it blew me away. I was absolutely astonished with how good this movie is. It follows Miles Morales, who is a young kid who loves Spider-Man, and he gets bit by a spider as well and realizes that he also has superpowers. And there is also an otherworldly invention that brings other versions of Spider-Man from different parallel universes into his own, and he has to help them get back. And he has to learn what it means to be a friend and what it means to be Spider-Man and what it means to be a hero. So if you think that animation or superheroes are a little bit too kiddish for you, throw that out the window. This one will completely change your mind. I have shown this to people who don't like superheroes. I've shown this to people who don't like kids movies. I've shown this to people who don't like animation, and they love it. It is a movie for everybody. It is my favorite movie of all time now. I have to say it's maybe a perfect movie if that exists. There's so much going on and it works so well. The comedy is great. The animation is beautiful. It's creative. It's different than any other animation that has come out recently. The soundtrack is super fun to listen to. It's just all around. I could say everything in this movie is good. It's just fantastic. So if you haven't seen it, or even if you have seen it, watch it again. Watch it over and over and over. It's fantastic. It's my favorite movie of all time. So that's Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse as my number one recommendation. So that's the episode. That's my time for today. So we talked about Onward, we talked about The Invisible Man, we talked about Emma, and I gave you guys my recommendations for my favorite Netflix films. And I'm really happy that I got to host this episode. So thank you guys so much for listening. I hope to be doing this again. And I hope you liked my recommendations. Ultimately, just go out and watch some movies. Movies are a great outlet. They're a great escape, and it's great to reflect on. And filmmakers put so much time into these movies for people to love. And go and watch your favorites, pick your favorites. There's so many good movies out there, particularly if you have some time during quarantine. So that's the episode for today. All of those are available on digital, either to rent or stream. I recommend all of them for different reasons. So I hope that you guys enjoy that. I hope you guys enjoyed this episode. I have been Casey Baum. And of course, thank you for listening to the GSMC Movie Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I would like to ask you that you please remember to subscribe to the show and write a nice review, because that really helps us. Also, if you can please follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Thank you so much, and have a good night.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Movie Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.